The first session that we're doing in our webinar series for 2015 is implementing the DEC Recommended Practices. And for those of you that aren't familiar with DEC, DEC is the Division for Early Childhood. It's a part of the Council for Exceptional Children. And they've recently updated their recommended practices for our field and the broader early childhood field. So we talk about a lot about it in our sessions, in our face-to-face sessions, so we thought it would be a great time to be able to get some information out to you about this rollout of the new recommended practices. And we're excited to have two presenters today who were part of the commission that put the recommended practices together. Chelsea Guillen, who many of you know as the Illinois Early Intervention Ombudsman, was one of the RP Commission members, and Tricia Catalino, who is an assistant professor and physical therapist, and many of you who've worked in EI for a little bit remember her. She was a PT in our field a number of years ago in Illinois. So we're excited to have both of them joining us today. Also, we'll have two moderators for today. Myself, and I'm the director of the Early Intervention Program. I'm Ted Burke. And Maria Maddox, who's a consultant with the training program. For those of you that are signed up for a number of our webinars that we have going on this first 3 months of 2015, you'll get to know Maria real well because she's going to be a moderator on all of them. So we're really excited to get this sort of new medium out to you guys. And I do want to let you know that we are recording this session and we'll be recording the other sessions as well. We'll have those available as an open resource up on our YouTube site. And we'll also make them available for folks who didn't get a chance to participate in this or other webinars to be able to watch it via our Moodle platform, which you're using right now, and be able to get early intervention credit for that as well. So we're really excited about that.
Thanks, Maria. Hi, everyone. My name is Tricia Catalino, and it's great to be here with you today. And to set the tone for the webinar, let's take a look at our session objectives. So our first objective is that we're going to discuss the framework and parameters guiding development of the DEC recommended practices. We're also going to share the newly revised DEC recommended practices. And finally, we're going to discuss some strategies for using the practices. So how do we implement these DEC recommended practices? Okay, Maria.
All right. So our first poll here has to do with who is already familiar with the revised 2014 DEC Recommended Practices. So I'll give you a few minutes to respond to this poll. Make sure that you are using the little box under your name so that you can check the responses. All right, we'll give folks a few seconds to do that. Take a second or two. Looks like we got more results coming in. All right. Let's see what our results are. So, looks like many of you knew they were coming. Many of you have glanced through them. Some of you have actually begun to implement them into your own practice. And there are a few that are on this webinar today to learn what they're all about. So thank you for your responses.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks again, Maria. So let's just do a little background, taking a look at the development of the current set of the recommended practices. So we'll just spend just a couple minutes going over this. But so many of you may know that the last set of practices were published in 2005. So in 2011, the DEC Executive Board appointed a work group to advise about whether and how to update the recommended practices. And this work group was made up of members who were part of writing the 2005 set of practices. And so that work group provided written recommendations to the DEC Executive Board about updating the recommended practices. And then DEC also gathered input from a wide range of stakeholders about the utility of the recommended practices and any issues that there may have been about implementation of the previous set of recommended practices. In 2012, DEC conducted a survey to gather input from the field and also held a series of forums about updating the recommended practices. And then the DEC shared those results of the survey and decided to collaborate with the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center and with support from the Office of Special Education Programs to update the recommended practices. In early 2013, the DEC went ahead and appointed a 13-member commission to develop a new set of recommended practices. And so, as you heard from the intro, both Chelsea and I had the opportunity to serve as commissioners and currently are commissioners on this commission. Okay, so the commission then created an action plan and a timeline to guide their activities. We defined parameters to inform recommended practices revisions, and we appointed some topic leads who established work groups to create the very first draft of these revised practices using the Commission's defined parameters. And then also each of the commissioners served as a liaison to one of the topic leads. So the crazy work really was going on in mid-2013 when the Commission continued to use an iterative process to produce a revised set of the recommended practices. We went through a validation process for the evidence nominated to support the revised set of recommended practices. And then in late 2013, early 2014, we conducted a field survey to further validate the practices. And then in March 2014, we finalized the revised set of practices. And then, as you know, the practices were published in April of 2014. So currently, we continue to identify and validate evidence in support of the practices, and we are, as you know, right now, doing some support to implement, how do we implement these practices in collaboration with the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center and others. So, for example, the Illinois Early Intervention Training Program. And we're developing an ongoing process for updating and validating the practices, because it really is the intent of the Commission that the practices are not static, that they are able to keep up with the evidence to support perhaps new practices or modifying current practices. So as the evidence becomes available, there are mechanisms to update the practices. Okay, so what really is the goal of the recommended practices? And so the goal is to inform and improve the quality of services provided to young children with or at risk of disabilities or delays and their families.
Okay.
Okay, so we've...
All right.
Yeah, go ahead, Maria.
So we have another poll here, and if you will, again, notice the box under your name that has either the letter or check mark. That way we can tally the results. The question is, where is the first place you go to get information about providing intervention to children and families? So there are your choices. We'll give you a few seconds to respond. Okay, we still see some more responses coming in. All right, another second or two. Okay, let's go ahead and publish our results here. So it appears that most of you get your information from in-service and professional development. I'm thinking that's probably the EI training program. Also, it looks like many of you are getting information from the journals or internet access that you have. It appears that many of you are also getting information from your professional associations as well. But the vast majority are going through professional development in service types processes. So thank you for responding.
Okay, so Tricia described a little bit of the background and the steps leading up to the development of the practices, and so I'm hopefully going to provide a little more information for you guys. One of the first things that we did as a commission was to really try to develop a framework about the practices that we were developing. For those of you who are familiar with prior versions, you may remember that they included both direct and support practices, but the Commission decided pretty early on in this revision process that we wanted this set of practices to be directed towards practitioners. And so if you look at this graphic, you can see that center square there really shows the focus of the practices. And so you can see that they're geared towards practitioners, and you can see the areas that we were hoping to address. Based on this discussion, we recognized, however, that practitioners' work is influenced by a number of other factors, some more closely related to practitioners' daily work than others. And so you can see these outer circles because certainly they influence what practitioners do on a daily basis, but some certainly are a little more peripherally related than others. But these are the factors that are represented in these outer circles here in our graphic. The Commission also decided that to the extent possible, we wanted these practices to be based on the best available research. And so for those practices that are still lacking a strong evidence base, we relied on accepted professional wisdom in the field. So these are intended to be practices that reflect common sense and that are frequently used effectively in our work with young children and their families. So after we decided who we were writing the practices for, we also needed to decide who we were writing them about. And so probably as many of you on the phone know, early childhood is defined differently in different places and across different fields. And so we really needed to come to a shared understanding of what population we were really gearing these practices for. And so what we settled on was children birth through kindergarten who either have or are at risk for developing developmental delays and disabilities. One piece that the group talked quite a bit about was not limiting it just to IDEA service eligibility. And so when we think about children maybe who have severe challenging behavior, we hope these practices will support our work with them as well. We also wanted the practices to represent the highest impact. And so I think Tricia talked moments ago about gathering information from the field. And a piece of information that we received is that the practices are great, but there are just too many of them for people to keep track of. And so we took that to heart. We really wanted to focus on those things that are highest impact. And so you'll probably notice that these practices are a little bit broader than probably what you might have been familiar with in earlier versions. By doing this, it allowed us to reduce the number, and so once again, we're hoping that helps. We also wanted to think about practices that represent the breadth of a topic. And so, for example, when you think about something like assessment practices, we wanted to make sure that we had practices that represented multiple aspects of this particular topic. Another parameter was that we really wanted practices that were observable so that people knew actually whether they were doing them or not. Another piece we really wanted to focus on is writing them in an active voice, and so we really wanted to avoid words like should. We wanted to talk about what people would be doing. Another choice we made was not to make them disability specific, and so hopefully these practices can cross different children, families, and intervention types. We also wanted to think about practices that could be delivered in all settings. And so you can imagine this is a challenge when you think about children birth to 5 and the various settings they participate in. But we wanted to make sure that these practices could be delivered both in natural environments as well as other inclusive settings. And then lastly, we really wanted to think about practices that built on but didn't duplicate standards for other typical early childhood settings. So some of you may be familiar with the DEC practices or developmentally appropriate practices. We're hoping these aren't a duplication but really an extension of our work with young children and their families. So as we said, the majority of the practices are practitioner-focused and research-based. The one exception is the one that you see right here on the top of the list, because we wanted to develop a set of support practices geared toward leadership. I think the commissioners all recognize that leaders can come from all levels and stakeholders within both early intervention as well as the early childhood special education system. The majority of our practices, however, are targeted towards practitioners. The leadership practices are meant to be directed towards people who are in positions of authority that are out there supporting practitioners in their daily work. So this, once again, is another graphic. Hopefully this kind of summarizes what Tricia talked to you about before. And so after we decided who the practices would be written for and about, we needed the actual process for developing the practices. And so I think you can see here the topic work groups that Tricia described. Then the commission would review the pieces. They would send that information back to the topic work groups, and all of that within the context of the framework, the parameters, and the definitions that we described earlier. If you see that little circle off to the side there, that really talks about the last piece that Tricia was addressing, and the fact that the commission is really committed to making sure that the information we're putting out there is validated by the evidence that's available in our field, and that it is continually updated so that these items don't become something that land on people's shelves but actually get used in everyone's daily work. So just to describe a little bit more, to expand what Tricia said earlier, when topic groups were assigned, those groups were given the task within the parameters that we've just discussed to nominate a set of practices and to provide the evidence that supported those practices. Then those practices, once again, were submitted to our commission via their topic liaisons, and an evidence review group, in addition to the commissioners, used a systematic process to validate the evidence that the topic work groups had nominated to see if it actually supported the practices as written. As you can imagine, some of what we found is that sometimes the evidence fit very nicely with the way that the practice had been proposed and written. In other instances, unfortunately, the evidence is still missing. And so we realize the work is not yet complete. And so there's actually a gap analysis group that will be meeting in the coming years to nominate additional evidence that can support the practices as they currently stand.
Okay, thanks, Chelsea. So sure. Where do you find these practices? Well, there's a couple places, and I believe that you may have been provided a link prior to signing on here, but the practices can be found both on the DEC website, and this is a screenshot of what that web page looks like, and you just would click right where that little click here to download a copy, and you should get a copy that pops up. So that's one place. And then the other place is actually the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center. And so they also have a link on one of their web pages. And here's a screenshot of what that looks like. And so this is also where you can get a copy of the recommended practices. So definitely available to anyone. You do not have to be a member of DEC to be able to download the recommended practices. We want people to have access to them and for you to share them with your colleagues, for sure. So now would be a good time, if you happen to have a copy of the recommended practices with you, to either pull it up or take it out, or whatever form you have, or if you need to maybe grab that link right now, because we are going to actually walk through some of the practices. And so while you're doing that, and what people are kind of getting ready, are there any questions, or can we provide any clarification on anything we've talked about thus far?
does look like we do have a question from out in the field. The question from Susan is, how are these DEC practices related to our Illinois principles and the national mission and key principles? So, ladies?
So I think, you know, I didn't call them out specifically, but I think how I mentioned earlier that our hope was that these practices would expand on and not duplicate some of the other efforts or some of the other principles, practices that guide our work in early intervention. So I think our hope is certainly that they are supportive of both Illinois and the national key mission and key principles, but I really feel like the practices really talk about how we do the work in early intervention. And I guess one difference that I would want to highlight is remember that these practices are also geared for children being served all the way up to age 5. And so it's not just specific to early intervention. Tricia, you have other thoughts?
No, I would agree. I mean, this is, you know, there have been some questions of, you know, whether these replace or duplicate or used instead of, but I agree with Chelsea. I think this is, these practices are meant for, as you'll see as we get into each of the practices, of giving examples of like, what does this look like? How can I take this and actually do it in my practice?
We also seem to have another question here from Chrissy. The question is, aren't these practices similar to research-based practices that are implemented through the RTI in public education?
Well, once again, I would certainly hope that they are similar to or supportive of. Once again, I think what we're really thinking about is a difference in age group, probably, for some of these practices. And then once again, we probably are really drawing from a similar evidence base. And so I would hope that there is certainly some commonality across them, but I'm still hoping they're not an exact duplication, but really thinking about an extension to the birth to 5 population.
Yes, I would agree.
Thank you. If anyone else has any other questions, please note that you can type those at any time in the chat box, and we can address them as needed at the time or during our designated times during our presentation. So please don't hesitate to ask these questions. Thank you.
Okay, so if you did have a chance to pull up the practices document, you'll notice that each topic area has a preamble describing and defining the topic. So here's an example of the preamble and then a few of the practices that follow in the leadership topic area right from the RP document. So if you do have that in front of you, you can see where you could follow along there. And we actually are going to go through each topic area now and kind of choose one practice from each area to illustrate how practice might be implemented. So kind of give you an example. We'll stop for questions and comments after we go over a few of the practices, but like Maria said, if you have questions at any time, please just let us know. So let's take a look at our leadership topic area, and we're actually going to use practice L13. So if you want to follow along, you can go right there. I'm going to actually read the practice to you, and then we'll look at an example. So for L13, it reads, leaders promote efficient and coordinated service delivery for children and families by creating the conditions for practitioners from multiple disciplines and the family to work together as a team. And so an example of that then for this leadership practice would be that maybe a director of an early intervention program would arrange schedules so that all staff working directly with families are in the office on certain afternoons to ensure time and structure for collaboration. So this is, as Chelsea was talking about earlier, leaders often have the power to kind of set up the environment for practitioners to kind of implement the practices, as you'll see moving forward as we go through these. So they are really an essential component. Okay, so moving on to the next practice area, we'll look at assessment. And so I'm going to read to you assessment 1, so A1, and then we'll look at examples for that area. So A1 reads, practitioners work together with the family to identify family preferences for assessment processes. And so an example of that would be a team of practitioners and the family jointly plan the specifics of the upcoming assessment, including the location, time of day, and strategies for the assessment. Okay, and then moving along to the next topic area, we'll look at environment. And again, I'll just read E4 this time. And so it reads, practitioners work with families and other adults to identify each child's needs for assistive technology to promote access to and participation in learning experiences. And a really nice example for this environment practice 4 is that perhaps a speech-language pathologist works with family members to incorporate the use of a child's voice output device across the family's daily routines. So for example, shows the family how to use the device during the morning routine so the child can communicate what he wants to eat for breakfast. Okay, so I quickly went through these first 3 topic areas, and you should have all of them in front of you if you did pull them up. And so if you have any questions at this time about these first 3 topic areas, leadership, assessment, environment, about any of the practices, this would be a great time to address that. So which of these practices do you think will influence your daily work? Which might be hardest to implement? And then if you just want to put those in the chat box, we can have a little discussion.
So as folks are processing the information that is being shared, we do have a comment from Sarah, and her comment is that the Leadership 13 feels like it could carry over to what a service coordinator does to try to get the team together at a common time. Any responses to that, ladies?
Sure. So I think you're right out of the gate kind of addressing what we were alluding to before. In reality, obviously, leaders come from all levels and positions within our system, but I think, right, this is really where you can think about support practices, and so really thinking about how do we support teams in their work and keep things moving forward. And so, right, it's thinking about how, like Tricia said, we create the conditions that would actually support implementation of those practices, and certainly service coordinators have a vital role in that.
It also looks like we have a comment from Lynn, and her comment is, it also feels like IFSP development time could also be used for teams to collaborate, which is how leadership at the system level supports collaboration.
Right, yeah. So that's a great point. And so once again, if you kind of remember back to that graphic, you know, there are lots of circles around there that support it. And so, right, I think we not only need to think about, right, how the front line, meaning the service coordinator and other members of a child's IFSP or IEP team support the practices, but also really thinking about, right, how system level policies and procedures can also support or hinder the use of these practices.
And I see another one from Pamela that I think has, sort of Illinois written all over it. Is one of the hardest things to implement is assessment due to the coordinating schedules and styles of the whole team.
Right, and so I think, yes, that is a difficult thing. I think one of the things, and the reason we picked the practice that we did, is really thinking about not just the professionals on the team and the difficulty coordinating those schedules and styles, but also including the family in that planning. And so really trying to think about things like what is a good time of day, or if there's a particular challenge that the family would like you to see or needs assistance with, can we schedule things in order order to get the best information we can about that particular issue. So yes, we hear repeatedly, and I'm hoping it's not just an Illinois issue. Maybe Tricia can chime in on how you guys handle it out there. You're right, that is a difficulty, but it's certainly something that's important to keep in mind and work to address. Do you have novel ideas that you implement in Nevada, Tricia?
You know, Chelsea, so Nevada, I mean, this is where, you know, it's all perspective, you know, so Nevada only just recently started having, requiring all team members to be at IFSP meetings. So Illinois, just, it's all perspective. So there's some things we all do well and do not, so it's okay.
Right.
I wish I could say,
yeah, so we're not alone in our challenge, but I think it is something that we continue to work towards, and I think, right, at least we're a little step ahead in that expectation has certainly been around for a while.
Absolutely.
So hopefully service coordinators and team members are working together to find times that work, because each perspective is so valuable to the overall outcome.
And I might add, for those of you who, obviously all of you who have some association with Illinois, I think you should feel really proud about the strides you've made in teaming. Just from moving to another state, I really miss some of that collaboration. So yeah, it's all perspective, like I say.
I think there's another longer comment, but I'm going to try and summarize, and it has to do with coordination between EI and the medical profession, and how do service coordinators help work with families who are, you know, maybe sometimes getting conflicting information from the medical field and asking EI to do things. So how do they deal with that challenge of maybe not as good a collaboration as we'd like?
Right. So I think that is a challenge, and I can only speak to some of the efforts that I know that are going on in Illinois' early intervention system. One thing that comes to mind is the work of the Service Delivery Approaches work group that's really looking at how we provide services in Illinois' early intervention system. And one of the pieces we've been talking about is really trying to intentionally think about who would be expanded members of a child's team. And so that group has done a fair amount of discussing the importance of coordination between medical and developmental systems. I can also tell you that through Illinois' work on the State Systemic Improvement Plan, one of the primary issues that's been identified in our system is both a lack of external knowledge about early intervention, which I think your scenario certainly addresses, but also sometimes a lack of internal knowledge. And so really thinking about, do people understand the differences between some of these systems, both the people who are referring to the system, but also the people working in the system, so that those miscommunications like the one that you just shared don't continue to happen. So I don't have a solution for you today, but I can definitely tell you that there are issues that the Bureau of Early Intervention is aware of and hopes to address in the very near future.
And so I see this question from Jennifer, and I'll just go ahead and, so great question, Jennifer, and about is there any kind of handbook that goes along with the DEC manual providing suggestions for what the implementation of the practice might look like? So this is actually our current work. And what we're interested in, and we'll, I might table this in terms of talking about products. We'll get to this kind of later in this presentation, but it's one of the things that the Commission is very interested in, is finding out what kinds of products are going to be helpful for practitioners as they implement the practices. And we have already created several examples of each of the practices that we are putting together to release to practitioners, so stay tuned.
So I think we're going to go ahead and move on. Did we get all the questions, Maria?
It looks like we did at this point in time. So yeah, if you want to go ahead and move on, that would be great.
Okay, so the next set of practices we're going to talk about are the family practices. And I think if you've kind of had a chance to look that over and review that preamble, like Tricia directed you to earlier, you'll really see for these practices, they're kind of three aspects of family practices. And so one is really thinking about the family-centered nature of the services we provide. It's also thinking about family capacity building, so kind of what skills and knowledge does a family need in order to support their efforts with their child. And then really thinking about family and professional collaboration. And so once again, how do team members work together? And so these all feel like these are very applicable to our work in early intervention. And so it's a set of practices, once again, that we really wanted to think about. And so I think when we think about the family-centered nature of practices, we've kind of focused on practice F3, and that one tells us that practitioners are responsive to the family's concerns, priorities, and changing life circumstances. And so this really helps us think about the fact that families aren't static, and that their needs and concerns will probably change nearly as often as each time that we see them. And so an example to kind of illustrate this, because once again these are pretty broad as they're written, it's really thinking about how a service coordinator assists the family in identifying and connecting to both formal and informal supports and resources, such as babysitting, respite care with family, friends, and neighbors. And so it's not uncommon that during our time in early intervention, a parent may go back to work, and so this just recognizes that a family's need for resources can change across time as well. And I think another really important aspect of this example is really thinking about both formal and informal support. So not just finding maybe long-term child care solutions, but thinking about, right, if they need help in the evening or need a break, how are we going to go about identifying that? And so, right, in Illinois' early intervention system, certainly that's a task that many service coordinators assist families with. Moving on to our next set of practices, those are the instructional practices. And so these are practices that describe the intentional and systematic strategies that we use to inform what to teach, when to teach, how to evaluate the effects of teaching, and how to support and evaluate the quality of the practices being implemented by others. And so what I really liked in the Commission's discussion of this set of practices was that we really thought about not only what the practitioner or the interventionist brings to the family, but really thinking about what family members and other caregivers can do in between the times that they're visited by their interventionists. And so for this one we picked, if you're following along, Instruction Practice 4, which talks about practitioners planning for and providing the level of support, accommodations, and adaptations needed for the child to access, participate, and learn within and across activities and routines. And so once again, kind of going back to Susan's issue earlier about how do these maybe support the key mission and principles, I think you see some very similar wording here. And so we're really thinking about, right, what is the family doing on a daily basis? How do we need to support or accommodate activities for the child to be able to be an active participant in those activities? And so an example or an illustration of this would be that an early intervention provider and a child's parents monitor their own behavior to ensure that they're providing the appropriate level of support for the child to be able to do a skill, and then fading back those prompts when appropriate. And so we kind of picked this picture of this little one who's clearly requiring a lot of support with walking at this point, but really thinking about, right, how would we modify both our behavior and the parent modify their behavior as the child becomes more independent with this particular skill. The next set of practices are the interaction practices, and these clearly are geared towards interaction. And so we know that sensitive and responsive interactional practices are the foundation for promoting the development of a child's language as well as cognitive and emotional competence. And so this is really thinking about, right, how do we go about supporting the children? And so we picked interaction practice 2. Once again, these are all great practices, but kind of limiting our field here. So this one is thinking about how practitioners promote the child's social development by encouraging the child to initiate or sustain these interactions with other children as well as adults during, once again, routines and activities. And how do we do that? By modeling, teaching, feedback, or other types of guided support. So once again, those are kind of really broad terms, and so here we want to really think about what that might look like actually in practice. And so as an example of that, an early interventionist who's working in the home encourages and reinforces a child for initiations and engagement with materials by providing choices. I'm guessing that's a strategy that a lot of you employ. Could also make suggestions. We want to make sure that we're giving the child time to make the choices and then providing positive descriptive feedback. And so I think once again this really targets on how we actually interact with the child in order to facilitate the skill set that we're targeting. So I think we're going to do the same thing we did after Tricia's set of practices. We want to give you guys a chance to kind of look through. Hopefully you were able to do that before you joined us and really think about which of these really speak to you. Are there things that you're already doing and or that you want to make sure you incorporate into your daily work? Are there any on there that you think people might struggle to implement? So if you can, once again, use that chat box and give us some of your feedback.
People are processing. We'll give folks a few seconds to kind of think about that and type in their comments. It appears that there are a few folks typing in, so we'll give folks a few minutes.
I guess another thing just that we would hope people are thinking about is also thinking about how these practices maybe already reflect what you do in early intervention. So as you're listening to some of these, does this really seem like the work you do on an ongoing basis? So I see Lynn's question. Do you want me to go ahead and jump in?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so Lynn, you're raising a point that got a lot of heated discussion in our work, and I'm sure as Tricia's reading it, she's laughing to herself, because I do think that this is a struggle. So I'm assuming everyone can see, but you know, one of the big differences that we talked about is when we think about early intervention versus early childhood special education, we have a different target audience, right? And so in early intervention, right, the role of the practitioner is to support the family in their efforts with their child. Obviously, when the family is no longer part of the setting, say in a preschool type environment, then obviously who we think about the practitioner would be different. And so no, as the practices are written, it is not a different practitioner when we're thinking about children under the age of 3. And so, but what you'll see is kind of what I alluded to earlier in those family practices. We want to think about, right, family, certainly in birth to 3, as being a primary interventionist, if you will. And so we really want to think about in all these practices, what is it that we as practitioners do to support the family's efforts with their child? And so that would be kind of those family capacity building practices that I described earlier, where we think about what skills and knowledge we can bring to the family in order to support their efforts with their child. You have other things, Tricia, that come to mind for you?
No, that's exactly right. And Chelsea, you're right. I was like, yeah, I mean, this was a big discussion point for all of us as we were trying to define practitioner across this age range, and then also completely, understanding that the family for children under 3, as it's defined, are clearly, providing many of these interventions. So the skilled knowledge and the unique knowledge and skills that each of interventionists bring to the table would be defined as kind of their practice, if you will.
It appears that Chrissy and Dana have a similar comment, similar thoughts, where they are think about making suggestions and helping parents know how and when to use strategies is key. Dana states that she's been using a sheet given to her at a training that highlights the time of day and what strategies could be implemented at that time. So there she indicates an example. So do you have any comments about their thoughts?
Yeah, so I think once again for me this is where these practices really are supportive of both the Illinois as well as the national early intervention principles. And so I think what the practices maybe add to that discussion is they talk about actual techniques that both practitioners can share with families, but also families can actually utilize. And so we really think about the child's IFSP outcomes. We know where the family wants them to go, but our role as practitioners is to help the family think about strategies that will help them achieve that. So I really do like that idea or suggestion of thinking about times of day when those strategies actually could be implemented by the family, because certainly that's going to help with carryover in between visits and probably will expedite the child's progress towards their identified outcome.
And then I think the next one, Maria, is from Pamela regarding interaction too. In this question about crossing the line, it relates to families' privacy. So this actually is a nice opportunity to talk about how none of these practices really stand alone. It is the whole set of practices, and so if you would think about then some other family practices where being sensitive to the family's needs, desires, goals, and then even cultural sensitivity. So the creativity might come from being able to be culturally sensitive or to know that line of privacy. And so that might be something as a practitioner you would have to be sensitive of. And so creative may mean, yes, the family really wants to dive into learning lots of different ways to interact with their child, but it also may mean all those other family practices that we have to keep in mind when we are supporting families and how much they want to bring us into their lives.
All right, you'll also see that there is a comment from Tammy discussing that how difficult it is to impress to parents the importance for young kiddos to learn to choose what they want and to use appropriate actions. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're right, Tammy. It's hard depending on how patient the child is, and so I know we've talked a lot about different parenting styles and different temperaments of children, and so right, some kids are going to be more amenable to that strategy and are more patient with that process. I think that for me, one of the things we want folks to keep in mind is that we have to think about the long-term desired outcome and which of these strategies are going to help us move closer to that and which ones might actually be interfering with that. And so, right, I'm guessing that the majority of our families want their children to ultimately be independent, to be able to communicate their wants and needs, and so really helping the family understand how particular strategies can be supportive of ultimately achieving that outcome. That being said, how we have those discussions with the family goes back to the point Tricia just raised, is really thinking about how we word that for individual families, because different families may need the message shared in different ways. We have to pace kind of how we share information. We want the family to be ready for it. We need to say things in the way that are going to be digestible and acceptable to them. And so, it is challenging, and I don't unfortunately think that the practices are going to change that for us, but it just gives us a few more tools in our bag of tricks, if you will.
Sure does. There are a lot of comments about implementing the various strategies and parent education and involvement. And I don't want to just read everything that everyone else can sit here and read as well. But there is a comment from Catherine who is talking about the importance of linking assessment to intervention and how the linkage can help families become more involved in their intervention. Any thoughts or comments about that?
I think this is absolutely hits it on the head here. And so if the family is part of the process from the beginning, so not just the day of the assessment, but planning for the assessment, I think that was one of our the practice that we highlighted. And so from the beginning, if they find their role to be key and that they are an important member of the team, it'll be, in my opinion, can be more, it can be easier to then have them be part of the intervention as well. And so really thinking about it from the beginning straight through to when maybe you won't be working with a family anymore for whatever reason, discontinuing services, transitioning, etc. So yes, agree wholeheartedly, Catherine. Thank you for that comment.
So I think the other thing that brings to mind for me too almost relates back to Tammy's issue that she raised earlier, and even the comment that Lynn made, and really trying to think about who's implementing the practice. And so I guess in my experience, one of the easiest ways to get a parent on board with a strategy that I'm suggesting is for them to have the opportunity to implement it and experience success with it. Because usually once they've become successful with a suggested strategy, then they're a little bit more open to future suggestions, and once they can see it actually work. And so I think sometimes the barrier is kind of for parents to think about a different way of doing things. You know, and it should be easier when they haven't had success with other strategies, but sometimes it may not be that this is within their comfort level. And so I think one of our tasks as practitioners is to really think about how we support and foster a parent's level of comfort with utilizing the strategies that we're bringing to them as well. I think that might relate to Stephanie's comment here. I'm just trying to read through real quick.
There's a lot of great information, and Lynn was very helpful in putting out a shout out to our EI training, Connect the Dots. So a lot of the resources that are being kind of talked about or shared do come from a lot of our EI training program training. So just wanted to put that out there for everyone. We should probably move on. I appreciate all of your comments. Please keep them coming. Love the fact that you're responding to each other. That's really, really great. So, Chelsea, Tricia?
Yeah, okay. So we're going to move on now. So we just have two more topic areas to go over. So the next one is teaming and collaboration. And again, obviously teaming is so important in the work that we do. And when you're thinking about a child who may benefit from any of the services that we provide, there is automatically going to be a team involved. So the parent certainly, and then whoever else may be working with the family. So it's important to think about practices that you know, to help us work with families in the team structure. So we're going to take a look at the teaming and collaboration number one, so the first practice. And so as it reads, practitioners representing multiple disciplines and families work together as a team to plan and implement supports and services to meet the unique needs of each child and family. And so this, I think, is familiar to all of us who work in early intervention, that this really in so many ways presents what we strive to do on a daily basis. And so an example of this is a physical therapist, a service coordinator, and a developmental therapist meet to talk with the family about the child's current abilities, progress, and other concerns. And you'll see now again how this practice doesn't really stand alone when you think about then those leadership practices of either the system or a director of an early intervention program, et cetera, really finding space and time for teams to meet to be able to do this. Okay, and then our last topic area is transition. And so this would be both the transition actually starting early intervention, but then the transition from children moving from early intervention to the preschool program or Part B services. And so the transition practices are really what are those things that we do, the events, activities, and processes associated with those key changes between environments or programs during the early childhood years. And so there are only 2 transition practices, and so we're going to actually take a look at transition practice 2. And so it reads, excuse me, sorry here. Transition practice 2, so practitioners use a variety of planned and timely strategies with the child and family before, during, and after the transition to support successful adjustment and positive outcomes for both the child and family. And an example of this, and this is where our service coordinator plays such a key role, but providing families with lists of preschools and visiting schedules, and then also offering to accompany families on their visits to the preschools. Again, just thinking about even how then those teaming practices and transition practices would kind of support each other in this way as well. Okay, so we are going to put some time aside now again to think about these topic areas and any comments or questions that you might have.
We'll give folks a few minutes to come up with their thoughts. And I want to thank Lynn again and just reconfirming that we have a lot of strategies that come through a lot of different trainings that we do in the EI training program. So any of our institutes can provide a lot of this information, so be sure to check those out as well. We'll give folks a few minutes to type up any other thoughts or comments they have. See some folks that are coming in here and typing some. So Chrissy's talking about the concern with consistency and collaboration and time. Any comments on that, ladies?
Yeah, Chrissy, this is, I mean, we understand that, I mean, these are challenges, right? And so when we're thinking about then what opportunity might we find, and so in some of the trainings that I've participated in regarding the recommended practices is really how can you use these practices to leverage your stand on carving out time for collaboration. And so we hope that these practices can be used as a way to go to either, you know, your colleagues or whoever may be your supervisor, if there is that kind of setup, or even at the state level, and thinking about it's challenging for practitioners to implement all these practices in the way they were intended without the support of the system and leaders. And so that might be something to think about. And then thinking about certainly how you are setting up your own schedule and if there are opportunities there that for creativity. But I get it. I mean, I worked as an EI provider for many, many years, and some weeks it works great and other weeks it all falls apart. So I feel you there.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, so as we mentioned before, each of the commissioners was a liaison, and so I was a liaison for this teaming and collaboration set of practices, and I think you're right. I mean, these are difficult things to figure out, and so we really wanted to focus this set of practices on thinking about what are the behaviors that people engage in that support these collaborative efforts. And so a big foundation of early intervention is that, you know, we have a team of professionals supporting each other and the family, and so what kinds of communication styles or what kinds of behaviors do we engage in to make these collaborations successful? And so I think if you read some of the other practices, you'll really see language around kind of honoring the skills and expertise of each individual team member, recognizing that each person contributes something quite unique to that team effort. And so, right, despite all these scheduling challenges, sorry, I lost my word for a minute there, it really is important to have everyone at the table so that the family's getting the support and information they need. So certainly doesn't mean they're easy, but they certainly are valuable if we can find ways to make them work.
We have a couple of questions about transition, and one of the comments has information about, comments about how helpful it is that the service coordinator can accompany families on their preschool visit. And another question about transition has to do with how important they feel that providers attend the transition meetings so they can learn about the school system. Any comments about those?
I'm afraid. So I do think, right, that one of our responsibilities is certainly getting information to families so that they feel like they can be informed decision makers. And I do think that to the degree possible, right, having the early intervention providers attend planning meetings for services beyond early intervention can certainly help families feel more supported. And once again, this is an area where I really think, you know, thankfully we have some policies and procedures in place that support that activity actually being able to be carried out. It doesn't, of course, address the scheduling issues that you guys have all described, but certainly I think it is a nice link between the two systems. I think also thinking about, to the degree possible, that we can share information, once again, with the proper consents and families' permission. Families can be excellent resources for each other as well, and so I guess this would be a time I'd really think about not only the service coordinator's role, but also the important work of LICs as well as the parent liaisons that are housed in each of the CFCs to really think about what they might add to this transition process as well.
There was a question from Beth, and her statement is, as a therapist, when you have a recommendation for the possible addition of another service, who is the first member of the team to discuss this with? The service coordinator, the parent, the other therapist? When not in a meeting with the full team present, what is the best way to collaborate?
So this is a great question, Beth. So I'm guessing when you're first thinking about this, so there's been some concern, and perhaps the family has brought up the concern, or you are noticing the concern. And I think that it would depend on, some things will depend on the relationships that you have already established with the family and how long you've perhaps been seeing the family. And I don't know, and so correct me if I'm wrong in terms of any policy that might be there in Illinois, but certainly getting some, asking some questions from the family about routines and challenges they might have will maybe help you establish whether an assessment is needed to determine whether services are needed, or if another service provider who's already seeing the family can perhaps provide those supports. And certainly you would be looking at your IFSP goals to determine whether there's a need there for this other service. So I don't know if there's a specific answer for the first team member to discuss it with. I think there's a lot of ways you can go about it. Chelsea, I don't know if I'm muddying the waters here.
I think it's a great question, but I think it's also potentially a great response. I mean, I do think you have to think about several different factors. And so I think one of the first questions I would ask back is it a concern the family has, or is it a concern that only the interventionist has? I think Tricia's suggestion of gathering some more information, I think we would encourage folks always to think about the current team members in place and their set of skills and expertise. And so, right, can we first try to provide support with the current team, or do we need some more information or another member of the team to access the skills and expertise that would be needed to help the family address the issue? So I don't know that there's always one right answer. I think for me, the first thing I would want to do is make sure that it's a concern that the family has as well, and either encourage them to contact their service coordinator or see if you can share that information with the service coordinator. Once again, it may not necessarily be adding a new person to the team. It may be reconvening the team to think about the outcomes and whether, once again, they address the family's changing priorities or not.
Well said, Chelsea. Thank you.
As part of my job as moderator, I do have to watch our time, and so it does appear we have about 8 minutes left, and we have a couple other questions that are probably some big ones. So we'll kind of combine a couple of these perhaps, and so that you can finish up the rest of your presentation. But Ted and Lynn and Amy kind of have some related questions there, as you can see. Ted's kind of curious about how we can better educate our policymakers in Illinois to support our recommended practices, and Lynn kind of adds on to that about doing that across all early childhood systems. And then Amy's kind of tacked on to that as well. And are there any plans to have any councils and statewide agencies? So that's a very, very big question.
Yeah, sure, yes. So I guess one of the things that I would tell people is I think that, you know, the push in the field certainly is to think about evidence-based practice. And so I think if you guys remember, or perhaps hopefully you participated at some point in some of the early webinars when our federal regulations changed. And so I think it was worded differently there. I think it was called scientifically based research or something like that. But the point was ultimately the same, that really the strategies that we should be using with young children and their families need to be grounded in some kind of evidence. And so we need to have some method for supporting why it is that we're doing what we're doing. And so I guess the good news is that it is supported even at the federal level. Of course, those federal regulations impact our state rule, and so you'll see some of that language carried over into state rule. But I guess the effort that I can think of going on in Illinois right now that most closely aligns to what you guys are requesting here is really the work through our state systemic improvement plan. And so once again, this is really an effort to think about how do we improve outcomes for children in early intervention. And one of the things that we need to do in that regard is to select improvement activities, so things we can do in the system that will improve outcomes. And all of those improvement activities have to be grounded in research. And so that's where I really see these pieces coming together. And I think we're going to talk in just a minute about some of the future work of the Recommended Practices Commission. But one of the pieces they've been focusing on is really doing a nice job of developing the evidence base behind these practices so that when states choose them as a way to improve outcomes for children, that information and the support for that practice is already out there. So certainly that work is going on, and that's a nice way to tie these pieces together. I don't know, Amy, of any work about agencies or councils, but certainly our bureau is intimately involved in that process. And I don't know, Ted Burke, are you running for something that I don't know about? Maybe Tricia has other ideas about things that are going on in some other circles as well.
Yeah, I know that you know, so I'm not aware that DEC is seeking out like looking for endorsement necessarily. So for the recommended practices themselves, I think that we have received feedback from different agencies who have been delighted to see the recommended practices were in print and ready to go. And I think this is just an exciting time because they're here. We are, you know, advertising the best we can, doing these sorts of webinars to get the word out. And then I really think that trying to empower practitioners and leaders, et cetera, to really bring these practices forward, not just in practice, but to make, as we were talking about earlier, like internal and external, you know, people and agencies aware of them. I think that's going to be, you know, real important work as we move forward. And so, Maria, are we just moving on to this slide here? I want to make sure.
Yeah, there's a note,
okay,
so go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so some future activities that we're going to be working on as the commission. So right now, and so we had already explained that we are writing examples for each of the practices. And we're also putting together a glossary. So that work is in process and actually almost complete. So look for that in the near future. And then there's also an ad hoc work group on the recommended practices, and so they're gathering information from DEC members and stakeholders regarding available, like the products and publications and other professional development strategies so that we can make sure we initiate a coordinated and comprehensive plan for dissemination of the RPs and then supporting materials, also looking at long-term coordination and future planning of these activities. And then there's also the Recommended Practices Panel of Excellence. And so this group of people will review the products related to the recommended practices and then endorse those products that are of high quality and meet rigorous standards. So there might be outside groups who put together publications or products about the recommended practices that who are not DEC. And so the Panel of Excellence is really going to take a look at those products and put DEC endorsement if they meet a certain level of quality. And then finally, OSEP funded centers also have specific tasks related to the recommended practices, and so the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center is also developing practices for intensive technical assistance for specific states. And IRIS, which is through, oh my goodness.
Vanderbilt,
I think. I didn't hear you. Say that again, Ted.
Vanderbilt.
Vanderbilt, thank you so much, is creating 5 modules to be used by college faculty and professional development providers on the recommended practices. So all these things are taking place concurrently, lots of different people involved, trying to get the best information out to those who use the practices.
So once again, I think this isn't exactly what some of you were suggesting in terms of Illinois-specific items, but I certainly think it is kind of a strategic plan to get the practices out to the field, and for those larger national entities that provide technical assistance and support to states, they will be using the recommended practices to guide their efforts.
Thank you. This is great.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.